There is a kind of silence in Ishinomaki that doesn't feel natural. It is not the silence of absence, but the kind that feels as if the air itself is too heavy to carry sound, as though every noise that is born simply sinks before it can ever be heard. In March 2011, this city was not merely struck by water. It felt as if it was swallowed by something darker than a disaster. The tsunami arrived within minutes, sweeping away homes, streets, and people, causing thousands to stop breathing at the same time. But for those who survived, that day was not the end. It became the beginning of something far more unsettling, something that would never appear in official reports, something that could not be explained by casualty numbers or damage statistics alone. In Ishinomaki, the sea never truly gives back what it takes. It only leaves traces behind. Those traces are not always visible, but they can be felt. In empty buildings, in streets that seem to lead nowhere, and in memories that slowly decay into something incomplete. But the most disturbing trace appears in the most ordinary place, the backseats of taxis that continue to operate past midnight, driving through a city that has not fully recovered from its loss. This is not just a story meant to frighten. These are testimonies, collected, documented, and studied. Around 2016, a sociology student named Yuka Kudo came to Ishinomaki. She was not searching for the supernatural. She approached the city with scientific skepticism, aiming to understand how post-disaster trauma shapes the way people think and feel. With a notebook and a voice recorder, she began interviewing taxi drivers, men who spent their nights navigating roads that had once been erased by the sea. At the taxi station, the atmosphere was unlike any ordinary workplace. The drivers sat in silence, some smoking without speaking, others simply staring at the empty road ahead. Their gaze felt heavy, as if they had seen something they could not forget. When Yuka began asking about strange passengers, no one laughed. No one dismissed the question as a joke. Instead, the conversation stopped. Some drivers exchanged glances, as if silently deciding whether the topic should be brought up at all. It took several days before one of them finally spoke. The driver did not sound dramatic. His voice was flat, restrained. He did not describe anything traditionally terrifying. Instead, he spoke of passengers who appeared completely normal, too normal. But there was always something slightly wrong, a strong, salty smell of the sea, clothes that were wet despite the absence of rain, and seats left damp after the passenger was gone, as if someone had been sitting there with a body that had just emerged from deep water. Yuka began to take her notes more seriously. Out of more than 100 drivers she interviewed, most had experienced nothing unusual. No strange encounters, no mysterious passengers. But 7 of them shared stories that were almost identical. 7 out of 100. A small number, but enough to form a pattern that could not be easily ignored. These 7 drivers did not know each other, were not in the same place, and had never discussed their experiences together. Yet their stories followed the same structure, repeating details in a way that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Every account began in a similar way. A passenger would appear near the ruins, usually late at night, often around the same hours when the tsunami had struck years before. They did not wave frantically or call out for help. They simply stood there, waiting. When the taxi stopped, they entered the back seat, gave a destination, and then said nothing for the rest of the journey. One of the most detailed cases came from a driver who picked up a young woman late at night. She was wearing thick winter clothing, even though the air was warm. Her long hair clung to her face, as if she had just come out of the water. Without saying much, she entered the back seat and gave her destination. The Minamihama district, a place that no longer existed, completely flattened by the tsunami. The driver continued driving, trying to treat everything as normal. But after a few minutes, something began to feel wrong. There was no sound of breathing from the back seat, no small movements, no shifting of position. Then, slowly, a single sound began to emerge inside the cabin, the sound of water dripping. Plock, plock, plock. The droplets hit the floor with a steady rhythm, far too clear in the silence of the night. The driver tried to ignore it, but the longer he drove, the more he realized something was off. The back seat felt too quiet for someone who was supposed to be there. Finally, he gathered the courage to look into the rearview mirror. What he saw was not a clear face, but a pale figure, almost transparent. The eyes were not fully visible, and strands of hair clung to the face, soaked with something thicker than ordinary water. There was no expression, no movement, only a presence that felt as if it did not fully belong to the same world. The car continued moving along the empty road. There was no sudden turn, no abrupt event. Yet inside that vehicle, something had changed. And in that moment, the driver realized something he could not explain. He was no longer certain whether he was transporting a passenger or something that should have never entered his car in the first place. However, among all of Yuka's notes, one interview left the deepest trauma on the young student. A driver recounted his experience of picking up a young man who seemed completely disoriented. The man sat rigidly in the back seat, his pale hands, wrinkled from prolonged exposure to water, resting on his knees. As the car passed piles of debris that had yet to be cleared, the man spoke in a flat tone, as if he were simply asking for directions. "Am I already dead?" The driver told Yuka that in that moment, his heart seemed to stop. He did not dare to answer. He just kept driving, his hands trembling violently on the wheel. When he finally gathered the courage to turn around and say yes, the back seat was completely empty. There was no sound of a door opening, no rustle of fabric, only a pool of murky water soaking into the seat, and the foul smell of seawater mixed with mud left behind. The man did not disappear out of fear. He disappeared because, in that moment, he realized that he was part of the destruction he had been looking at through the window. As a sociology student, Yuka Kudo tried to find a gap in logic. She studied the concept of grief hallucination, the projection of the mind caused by collective loss. She argued that these taxi drivers might have unconsciously created these illusions, shaped by the trauma of losing loved ones in the tsunami. However, her logic began to collapse when she examined the taxi meter records. Some drivers had actually turned on their meters, allowing the fare to run for passengers who did not exist. Financially, they suffered losses, yet they chose to pay for the ride themselves rather than risk offending a spirit that might simply be trying to go home. Why would hallucinations be so structured? Why did they all ask to be taken to homes that had already been swept away by the waves? One night, standing alone in the empty land of Minamihama, Yuka realized something. If this was a hallucination, then the entire city was dreaming the same nightmare at the same time. By the end of her research, Yuka Kudo was no longer the same person who had arrived. On her final journey leaving Ishinomaki, she sat inside a taxi on a foggy midnight road. Suddenly, the driver slowed down, then stopped in the middle of an empty street. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, his face drained of color. In a voice that was barely there, he asked, "Miss, the person sitting next to you, why don't they have a face?" Yuka turned to her side. She saw no one. Yet she felt an intense cold creeping across her skin, followed by the stench of dead, rotting seawater. In that moment, Yuka realized something. In Ishinomaki, the victims of the tsunami never truly left. They are still there, lining the roadside, waiting for the next taxi to take them home, to places that no longer exist. Because in this city, the tsunami never truly receded. It only changed form, becoming shadows that sit quietly in the back seat, waiting for someone to acknowledge that they were once alive.